Flammas eius Lucifer matutinus inveniat, illa inquam Lucifer, qui nesciet occasum. At every Catholic Easter Vigil, a deacon sings that line of Jesus Christ. The word at its center, Lucifer, is the same word the King James Bible gives to Satan. The Church has sung Christ as Lucifer for 14 centuries at the least, and perhaps 16 in the Roman Rite, without scandal. And most of the English-speaking world has never registered that the name of the Saviour in the chant and the name of the devil in the Bible are, letter for letter, one word. The English of the line, may this flame be found still burning by the morning star, the one morning star which knows no setting. The morning star is Christ. The Latin for morning star is Lucifer. The word functions here as a poetic title for Christ in the liturgical register, the way lamb and vine and bread of life do, never as a proper name. The line comes from the Exsultet, the Easter Proclamation, composed at some point between the late 4th century and roughly 600 and surviving in the Gallican sacramentaries of the 7th and 8th centuries. Counted from those oldest surviving books, the chant predates Dante by roughly 6 centuries and Wycliffe by nearly 7. It will be sung again next Easter in cathedrals and basilicas and parish churches, in Latin and in the vernaculars. That the English Bible gives the same word to the devil rides heavily on one verse, Isaiah 14:12, in one translation lineage. The broader identification of Satan with a fallen rebel was older and wider, knit from a weave of texts. Ezekiel 28's lament over the king of Tyre, Wisdom 2:24 on the envy of the devil, Luke 10:18 with Satan falling like lightning, Revelation 12's dragon cast down, brought together by patristic typology and stabilized across centuries of medieval Latin theology, vernacular preaching, mystery plays and iconography before any English Bible printed the word. The King James translators did not invent the identification. They inherited a centuries-old composite reading and gave its English vocabulary its most circulated form. The word in your mouth has one meaning. The word in the cathedral has another. The Hebrew word underneath them both, in the Taunt song against the king of Babylon 26 centuries ago, carried a third. The light bringer of the Gnostic Gospels, buried in jars in the Egyptian desert, carried a fourth, in texts that never used the word at all. The 1709 French grimoire that produced the V-shaped sigil, now overlaid on TikTok eye diagrams, carries a fifth. 5 readings the centuries have not reconciled, and only the first 2 share so much as their 7 Latin letters. What follows defends no figure named Lucifer. It puts the 5 readings back in front of each other and asks which one you were handed, by whom, and when. The question turned up because the research we were doing on the medieval flattening of cosmological imagery surfaced one verse, sung once a year in Latin, that the centuries forgot to translate out of the liturgy. We were tracing the Saturn-Satan transit and Augustine's dual reading and the medieval Latin demonological consolidation. And on the way, the Easter Vigil interrupted us with a word we thought we knew. The interruption became a months-long reading. This is what it found. Forgetting is its subject, with one distinction the essay will earn. The learned tradition did not forget so much as subordinate, holding the historical Babylonian king in its commentaries, while the popular and devotional mind let him drop from sermons, frescoes, and ordinary belief. What was forgotten in the pew, not in the library. Reading in the deepest sense is its method. There are 5 movements. You arrived at this piece carrying one meaning of the word. In modern English, Lucifer names Satan, the fallen rebel angel, the figure of evil. The denotation is so total that a child given the name today would be assumed to be the child of a Satanist or the protagonist of a horror film. The denotation is also young. Most of the English-speaking world has carried it for less than 500 years. The trail back from your inheritance runs through 5 specific historical fixings. Listed in chronological order, each one builds on the inheritance of the one before it. The first fixing was Dante's Inferno, completed roughly 1314. The full Divine Comedy was completed around 1320, shortly before Dante's death in 1321. Canto 34 of the Inferno places Lucifer at the absolute bottom of hell, frozen in ice from mid-breast down, line 28, da mezzo al petto uscia fuor della ghiaccia, From mid-breast he issued forth from the ice, chewing Brutus and Cassius and Judas in 3 mouths. Dante's Italian Lucifero became the European literary touchstone for the figure. Dante did not invent the identification. Medieval iconography, mystery plays, scholastic demonology, and Gregory the Great's exegesis had already stabilized it. What Dante added was vernacular crystallization. He popularized the identification in vernacular Christian culture so successfully that the historical referent of Isaiah 14 disappears from the popular imagination of the figure he was naming. The second fixing was John Wycliffe's late 14th century English Bible translation, c. 1382, which transliterated Jerome's Latin Lucifer directly into Middle English at Isaiah 14:12, 68 years after Dante completed the Inferno. Wycliffe was working from the Vulgate, not from Hebrew, so the choice in front of him was whether to keep Jerome's Lucifer, paraphrase it, or vernacularize it as Day Star or Shining One. He kept Jerome's word. The translation circulated in manuscript and was driven underground by the Constitutions of Oxford, 1407 to 1409, under Archbishop Thomas Arundel, which explicitly banned unauthorized English Bible translations. The Council of Constance in 1415 separately condemned Wycliffe himself as a heretic posthumously and ordered his bones disinterred and burned. The translation was carried forward by the Lollards as an underground tradition. Wycliffe did not create the Lucifer as Satan identification, which already existed across European vernacular Christian culture and which Dante had just crystallized in Italian. What Wycliffe did was transmit Jerome's specific Latin transliteration into English scripture as the canonical word at this verse. The third fixing was the Geneva Bible, 1560, the Protestant English translation produced by Marian exiles in Calvin's Geneva. The Geneva Bible kept Lucifer at Isaiah 14:12. The choice is notable because Calvin himself, in his Latin commentary on Isaiah, 1551, English translation 1609, rejected the verse as a literal historical proof text for Satan's fall, and called that reading ignorance, even while he accepted Satan's fall as Christian doctrine and allowed the verse a typological application. The Geneva translators were working within Calvin's immediate intellectual world, and kept the inherited transliteration anyway. Cultural inertia is older than the Reformation. The Reformers reformed what they could and left what they could not. Between Wycliffe and Geneva sit the Lollard manuscripts, Coverdale's 1535 first complete printed English Bible, translating Isaiah from the Vulgate, Luther's German, and the Zurich Bible, and keeping Lucifer at 1412, and Matthew's Bible, 1537, each of which also retained the word. The English translation tradition was monolithic on the verse from the moment Scripture entered English print. The fourth fixing was the authorized version of King James, 1611. Here the historical hinge sharpens into a question. By 1611, the Protestant world was familiar with Calvin's commentary on Isaiah, which rejected reading the verse as a literal historical proof text for Satan's fall, calling that reading ignorance, though Calvin himself accepted Satan's fall as doctrine and allowed analogical application. Luther had likewise criticized the strict Satan as literal referent reading, but there was no clean Protestant consensus against a typological Satan reading. Many Protestant theologians continued to hold both layers simultaneously, treating the verse as historical mockery of Babylon and as a typological figure of the devil. What was contested was whether the verse referred to Satan. What was widely held was whether it figured him. The KJV translators worked inside this dual landscape and inside an English translation lineage that had been unanimous on the verse for over 2 centuries. Wycliffe, late 14th CE, Coverdale, 1535, Matthew's Bible, 1537, the Great Bible, 1539, the Geneva Bible, 1560, and the Bishop's Bible, 1568, their primary working base, had all kept Lucifer. They produced an authoritative English Bible for the Church of England that could displace the Geneva Bible without rupturing congregational familiarity. They kept Lucifer. How much of that choice was theological commitment, how much was conservative continuity with the inherited translation lineage, and how much was political caution about a population accustomed to the older rendering is a matter of interpretation rather than settled fact. What is not interpretive is the result. The KJV's Lucifer is the word in your mouth, the dominant English language vocabulary downstream of Protestant culture, the standard register of Anglophone denunciations of Lucifer, the conspiracy ecosystem's claims about Lucis Trust, or the Vatican Audience Hall, or the CERN logo, the TikTok overlay of the Grimorium Verum sigil on an eye diagram, all draw their English vocabulary from that 1611 choice. The translators left the older reading in place. The cultural inheritance carried it forward at a velocity neither Calvin nor Luther had foreseen. The fifth fixing was John Milton's Paradise Lost, 1667. 56 years after the KJV. Milton handles the name more carefully than his reputation suggests. Lucifer appears 3 times in the whole epic, and each time the poet flags it as a human approximation. The rebel seat in heaven is the Palace of Great Lucifer, a name Raphael at once qualifies as what that structure would be called in the dialect of men interpreted. Book 5, line 760. When the name touches the angel himself, the hedge returns. So call him, brighter once amidst the host of angels, then that star the stars among. Book 7, line 131. Pandemonium is the proud seat of Lucifer, so by allusion called, of that bright star to Satan paragoned. Book 10, line 424. The pre-fall name itself Milton withholds entirely. Satan, so call him now. His former name is heard no more in heaven. Book 5, line 658. And yet the fixing happened, in the reading rather than on the page. 3 hedged occurrences were enough. Paradise Lost taught 3 centuries of English readers that the brightest archangel had been Lucifer before the fall, and Satan after. A doctrine the poem is careful never to state outright. Milton did not invent the identification. Medieval demonology, mystery plays, centuries of vernacular theology, Dante's Inferno, and the English Bible vocabulary from Wycliffe through the KJV had already stabilized Lucifer as Satan in the European Christian imagination and in English scripture. What the epic added was the highest authority literary form of the identification in English. After Milton, the figure has a canonical English voice. Blake's Devil's Party remark, which we will come to in Movement 4, was made against Milton specifically. The romantic recovery happens against Milton because Milton became the wall, not because he built it alone. You are downstream of all 5 fixings, capped by Milton's literary canonization. So is everyone reading this. The word in your mouth is a translation choice carried through 6 centuries of vernacular Christian culture, reinforced at every step by translators and poets and confessions and trials, and never quite undone. The Lucifer as Satan identification itself is older, patristic, medieval, established in popular religious imagination by the 12th to 13th centuries, but the dominance of Lucifer as the English word for the devil dates from the post-Tyndale translation tradition and its consolidation in the KJV. The undoing of the wording began in the 19th century critical scholarship and is now the standard in every major modern English Bible translation: NRSV, NIV, ESV, Nabre, JPS Tanakh, none of which still print Lucifer at Isaiah 14:12. But the cultural inheritance of the word lags. The word in your mouth is older than the King James and younger than the Cathedral. The Cathedral is the next movement, before continuing, a discipline. The word Lucifer operates in this essay at 3 distinct semantic registers that share the same 7 Latin letters and almost nothing else. The first is the Latin common noun, the standard astronomical word for the planet Venus, visible at dawn, used by Cicero and Virgil and Ovid, without theological weight. The second is the Christian liturgical title, a poetic figurative epithet applied to Christ in the same register as lamb or vine or bread of life, never functioning as a proper name. The third is the English proper noun the post-Milton KJV inheritance produced, a fixed denotative name for Satan. These are 3 kinds of usage, not 3 points on a continuous semantic line. They share orthography and almost nothing else. Holding them apart is the work this essay is doing. Whenever Lucifer appears in what follows, the register it operates in is named or made clear by context. The argument is that English language culture has folded the 3 into one without noticing, and that the folding is recent, traceable, and undoable by careful reading. No claim is made that the three registers are secretly one figure, or that the older was truer than the younger. Latin Lucifer is descriptive, not theological. The morphology, lux, light, plus fere, to bear, to carry, light-bearer, light-bringing. Cicero uses the word for the planet Venus in De Natura Deorum 2.53, Stella Veneris, quae phosphoros grace, Lucifer, Latina dicitur, cum antegreditur solem. The star of Venus, called Phosphoros in Greek and Lucifer in Latin when it walks ahead of the sun. When it follows the sun, Cicero adds Hesperos. One body, two names assigned by position. Virgil uses it for the same planet visible at dawn. Ovid uses it for the dawn light generally. The word covered the morning star as astronomical object and the dawn light as poetic image. It was descriptive before it was theological. It is older than the doctrine that happens to it. The Greek twin, phosphoros, also light-bearer, also a name for Venus. The earlier Greek form is Eosphoros, dawn-bringer, which is the word Hesiod uses in the Theogony, line 381, for the son of Eos and Astraeus. Phosphoros became the later standard term for the same figure. Both words designate the morning star. The Greeks distinguished Phosphorus, the morning star, from Hesperus, the evening star, and treated them as separate gods, though the knowledge that the two were one celestial body arrived early. The doxographers credit the discovery to Pythagoras or to Parmenides in the late 6th or early 5th century BCE, Diogenes Laertius, 8.14 and 9.23. The doubling outlasted the knowledge. The names persisted past the astronomy. Beyond Isaiah 14:12 itself, the Latin word Lucifer appears in the Vulgate Bible at exactly 4 further loci, and at every one of them it is applied to Christ, to the righteous, or to the morning star in its season. 1 2 Peter 1:19, Donec dies elucescat et Lucifer aureatur in cordibus vestris. Until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. The Latin uses Lucifer. The underlying Greek is phosphoros, applied to Christ. 2 Psalm 109, 3 in the Vulgate numbering, 110, 3 in the Hebrew and Protestant tradition. Tecum principium in de virtutis tuae in splendoribus sanctorum, ex utero, ante Luciferum, genuite. With thee is the principality in the day of thy strength, in the brightness of the saints. From the womb, before the morning star, I begot thee. The Latin uses Luciferum, accusative of Lucifer. Read in Catholic exegesis as God the Father speaking to the Son, affirming the Son's eternal generation before the creation of the morning star. Prominent in Christmas Vespers in the Latin Rite. 3rd, Job 11:17, Orieris ut Lucifer, you will rise like the morning star. The Latin uses Lucifer, applied to the righteous man. 4th, Job 38:32, Numquid producis Luciferum in tempore suo, do you bring forth the morning star in its season? The Latin uses Lucifer. God speaking from the whirlwind, astronomical reference. Thematically adjacent, the same morning star image carries through 2 further verses where the Vulgate uses Stella rather than Lucifer. Revelation 22:16 renders the Greek ho aster, ho lampros ho proinos, as stella splendida et matutina, the bright morning star, Christ speaking. Numbers 24:17 has Orietur stella ex Jacob, a star shall arise out of Jacob, read by Justin Martyr, Origen and Eusebius as a prophecy of Christ and absorbed into the Christmas star iconography by the early medieval period. The Vulgate's Latin in both verses is Stella, not Lucifer. The image of the morning star applied to Christ is the same. The word the Latin chooses is different. The point this matters for is that the morning star Christological image in Latin Christianity is broader than the single word Lucifer. The word and the image are linked but not identical. Beyond the Vulgate, the Latin Lucifer in its Christological sense lives most consequentially in the liturgy. The Exultet, the Easter Proclamation, composed at some point between the late 4th century and roughly 600 and preserved in the Gallican sacramentaries of the 7th and 8th centuries, Bobbio Missal, Missale Gothicum, Missale Gallicanum Vetus, is the liturgical continuation of the same tradition, Lucifer Matutinus, qui nescit occasum, the morning star which knows no setting. The astronomical Venus does set, the rising sun extinguishes it. The Christ who never sets exceeds the astronomy the metaphor draws on. The metaphor is taken up, then taken past itself. The chant is liturgy, the inheritor of the scriptural image rather than scripture itself. The last Latin Christological Lucifer in the inventory belongs to a man. Lucifer of Cagliari, Bishop of the See of Cagliari in Sardinia, died c. 370 or 371 CE. Anti-Arian polemicist, exiled by the Emperor Constantius II, eventually returned to his see. His followers became known as Luciferiani, a 4th century Christian sect named after him. The name was given without scandal because in 4th century Latin Christianity the word meant morning star, and the morning star meant Christ, and a bishop named Lightbearer participated in a Christological metaphor every parish priest would have recognized. What today would mark a child as a Satanist marked a bishop more than 1600 years ago, as named for the dawn his liturgy sang of as Christ. Augustine wrote in the early 5th century. The terminology around Lucifer had not yet fully stabilized as a name for the devil in his time. The word in the Latin of his era still moved between Christological epithet, astronomical reference, and typological figure of the rebel power. And Augustine's own pages attest the astronomical sense and the typological one. The conflation that the modern reader treats as natural was operative typologically, but not yet denotatively. And then Augustine performs the hinge that the Latin West will spend the next 1,000 years failing to imitate. In De Civitate Dei, Book 11, Chapter 15, he cites Isaiah 14, names Lucifer, and applies the verse to the devil, while keeping the historical referent. Isaiah says, when he represents the devil under the person of the king of Babylon, "How are you fallen, O Lucifer, son of the morning, under the person of the king of Babylon?" Hold that phrase. Augustine in the early 5th century is keeping both readings simultaneously. The verse refers to the historical Babylonian king who hubristically claimed divinity, and typologically to the devil. The historical and the typological coexist. The text holds both. This is an influential Latin patristic reading of Isaiah 14, and it is preserved in the learned medieval tradition, which kept the literal historical and the typological satanic alongside two further senses, moral and anagogical, for the next 1,000 years. What the popular and vernacular tradition does is different. It lets the historical referent drop out of devotional imagination, sermon usage, mystery play characterization, and visual iconography. The dual reading survives in the commentary tradition. The popular religious mind narrows to the single denotation. The learned tradition that followed Augustine did not drop the verse, it built on it. Gregory the Great, in the Moralia in Job, Book 34, the exposition of Leviathan as the devil, reads Isaiah's "I will ascend into heaven. I will be like the Most High" as the charter of Satan's first sin, pride, set against the humility of Christ. Aquinas reaches the same verse in the Summa Theologiae, in the question on the sin of the angels. The first sin of the angel, he concludes, could be none other than pride. And in the next article, asking whether the devil desired to be as God, the authority he sets against every objection is Isaiah's "I will ascend into heaven, I will be like the Most High" spoken, Aquinas says, in the person of the devil. This is the dual reading hardening into a tool. The historical king stays in the commentary, and the verse does new theological work as the autobiography of the devil's fall. This hardening into doctrine was a Latin event, though the typological reading itself was born in Greek. Origen set Isaiah's fallen morning star on the devil in the 3rd century, and Gregory of Nazianzus preached the Hieosphorus darkened by pride at Constantinople in 380. What the Greek East also kept and the Latin West did not was a school that refused the move. Theodoret of Cyrus, the last great commentator of the school of Antioch, read Isaiah 14:12 in the early 5th century as the taunt against the king of Babylon, a man called Morning Star for a dawn he claimed and could not hold. The illusion the prophet mocks. No rebel angel. The Antiochene literal method kept the historical referent that the Latin West let its popular imagination drop. And the conflation the modern English speaker treats as a universal Christian fact turns out to be a reading that one disciplined school, working in the same Greek, examined and refused. By Dante's Inferno, Canto 34, in the early 14th century, Lucifer is simply the proper name of Satan, locked in the ice at the bottom of hell. In the popular register, the historical king is gone, dropped from the sermons and the frescoes and the mystery plays and the language of ordinary belief. Only the Cathedral liturgy, kept in Latin, preserves the older sense underneath. This is what the Cathedral knows. The word in the Cathedral has been Lucifer matutinus since before the modern English language existed. Every Latin Rite Catholic congregation from the foothills of the Alps to the coasts of North Africa has sung of Christ as the morning star, which knows no setting, century after century, while the vernacular cultures above the liturgy forgot what the chant was saying. The Cathedral is the geological substrate. The modern English usage is a thin layer of soil over it. Underneath the Cathedral sits the source the Cathedral was translating, Isaiah chapter 14 verse 12. The Hebrew text reads, Ek napalta misamayim Helel ben Sahar, how you have fallen from heaven, Helel ben Sahar, shining one, son of dawn. The word Helel appears once, one time, once in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is a hapax legomenon, the technical term for a word that occurs only once in a corpus, the most fragile kind of evidence philology knows. Be precise about what is alone here, the noun. The same string of letters, pointed the same way, stands at Zechariah 11:2 and in Ezekiel's Oracle of the Sword. And there it is a different word entirely, the imperative of Yalal, wail. A twin spelling that howls. Standard modern etymology derives it from the root hel, to shine, to be radiant. The medieval commentator Rashi derived it from a neighboring light root yil, to give light. The 2nd century Greek translator Aquila of Sinope read it instead from Yalal, to wail, to howl. 2 of the 3 derivations land on brightness and 1 on lament. Even the sense is not settled in the source. The address. The verse is part of a masal, a taunt song against the king of Babylon. Read Isaiah 14:4, and the apostrophe is explicit. You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. The whole song, verses 4 through 21, is mock elegy in the prophetic genre, comparing the Babylonian king's hubristic rise and fall to the morning star, which mounts the dawn sky and is extinguished by the rising sun. Behind the Hebrew taunt sits a Canaanite mythological substratum that scholars have reconstructed across the last 130 years from fragmentary evidence. Hermann Gunkel proposed the basic shape in 1895 in Schöpfung und Chaos in Urzeit und Endzeit. John Day elaborated it in Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan, Sheffield 2000. The reconstructed myth, a lesser god called Helel, whom scholars identify with the Ugaritic morning star deity Athtar, attempts to ascend to the throne of the high god, fails and descends to the underworld. The fragmentary Ugaritic Baal cycle, KTU 1.6, preserves a related episode in which Athtar attempts to occupy Baal's vacant throne and finds himself too small for it. His feet do not reach the footstool, his head does not reach the headrest. He descends. This reconstruction is influential scholarship rather than settled fact. The Ugaritic textual evidence is partial. The Helel-Athtar identification is inferred rather than attested in the same source, and not every Hebrew Bible scholar accepts the parallel. The reconstruction is the strongest available account of the substratum, but it is account, not record. The astronomical mechanism is exact. Venus is the brightest natural object in the sky after the sun and moon. At certain phases of its synodic cycle, Venus rises before dawn, climbs the sky and is then extinguished by the rising sun. The brightness mounts, the star reaches a high point, and then disappears in light brighter than itself. A myth about Venus is a myth about reaching for a height one cannot hold. The Babylonian king receives this image because the king has done what the morning star does. The conceit is astronomical, then political, then prophetic. Behind the prophet sits the Canaanite poet. Behind the Canaanite poet sits the planet. Behind the planet sits the geometry of the sun and the orbits of Venus and Earth around it. The taunt song is recursive all the way down. The verse is a deep verse, most modern uses operate at the surface. To set it against the Ugaritic Baal cycle, against the Babylonian astral religion the prophet was satirizing, against the planet itself, is to recover something the popular reading has trained itself not to ask after. Classical rabbinic Judaism did not standardly read this verse as a rebel angel. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, a Geonic period midrashic compilation dated by current critical scholarship to the 8th to 9th century, derives its fallen angel material from Genesis 6 and the Garden of Eden, not from Isaiah 14. The synagogue's own Aramaic rendering, the Targum to the Prophets, reads Hillel ben Sahar as the planet Venus, and applies it to a conqueror, dashed down to the earth, you who were a slaughterer among the nations. Rashi, the 11th century commentator and the most studied of them all, reads the whole verse the same way. Hillel is Venus, the bright morning star, and the lament is over the prince of Babylon. One clause later, at you have been cut down to earth, Rashi gives the ruin its name, Nebuchadnezzar. Individual medieval and later Jewish commentators occasionally drew the connection to a fallen angel. But from the Targum through Rashi, the mainstream rabbinic reading remained the historical taunt against Babylon. John Calvin called the Satan reading ignorance and held to the historical reference. Martin Luther, lecturing on Isaiah, denied that the verse spoke of the fallen angel at all and read it as figurative language for the king of Babylon. Two of the foundational reformers thus dissented, in agreement against the medieval Latin tradition, from the reading their inheritance had given them. The KJV translators in 1611 worked in an English Protestant scholarly world that had absorbed Calvin's published commentary on Isaiah, Latin 1551, English 1609, and Luther's writings in Continental and English translation, and chose the inherited reading anyway. Movement 1 named that choice. Movement 3 names what they chose against. The Vulgate translator at Isaiah 14:12 says in his own commentary that he chose a translation. Jerome's Commentariorum in Isaiam, preserved in Migne's Patrologia Latina volume 24, contains the verbatim Latin pro eo quod nos interpretati sumus ob facilitatem intelligentiae, quomodo sesidisti de coelo, Lucifer, qui mane oriebaris in Hebraico, ut verbum exprimamus ad verbum, legitur, quomodo sesidisti de coelo, ulula fili de luculi. For what we translated for ease of understanding as, how have you fallen from heaven, Lucifer, who rose in the morning? The Hebrew, if we express word for word, reads, how have you fallen from heaven, whale, son of dawn? Ob facilitatem intelligentiae. For ease of understanding. The translator names his translation as a translation, and what he is naming is a choice between two available Latin renderings. Lucifer was already the standard Latin word for the planet Venus and the morning star image in classical and Christian Latin. The Aquila Yalal reading would have produced the jarring ulula fili de luculi. Jerome chose the conventional Latin idiom over the rough word-for-word reproduction. This is ordinary translation work, what every Vulgate translator did at every verse where Hebrew imagery had an established Latin equivalent. What is noteworthy is that Jerome documents the choice rather than letting it pass invisibly. He flags it. The flagging is what later readers stopped seeing. There is no scandal in Jerome's choice. The choice was conventional Latin. The scandal is in centuries of later readers treating the convention as the source, as if Hebrew Hillel simply meant Latin Lucifer, and Latin Lucifer simply meant English Lucifer, and English Lucifer simply meant Satan. None of those equalities holds at the word level. They hold only at the level of an inherited reading whose layers we have stopped distinguishing. And one more distinction, owed to the tradition this essay spends most of its time correcting. Typology, practiced knowingly, is legitimate canonical reading. The tradition that set Isaiah's fallen morning star beside Ezekiel 28 and Luke 10:18 and Revelation 12 was building a deliberate composite, and at its best it knew the composite was a figure. Augustine's under the person of the king of Babylon is that knowledge held in a single phrase. The error this essay traces is narrower and verbal. The collapse of figure into denotation the moment the reading forgot it was a reading, and the word itself became the devil's proper name. If you have ever met the word Lucifer in Isaiah 14:12, in any English Bible or in any sermon, You have met Jerome's choice carried forward through 1,000 years of Latin transmission and 4 centuries of English transmission. You have not met the Hebrew directly. The Hebrew is the shining one from the root whole, the reading the Greek Septuagint had already followed, or the wailing one from Yalal, the reading Aquila set against it in the 2nd century. Neither of those is the modern English Lucifer. Lucifer in modern English is the inherited weight of Latin convention, medieval typology, vernacular flattening, and English literary fixing, all carried inside the same 7 letters Jerome had set down for the planet Venus. The 4th reading is the most radical, and it was buried in a jar in the Egyptian desert for nearly 1,600 years. Before the Gnostic source, there is a second scriptural source for the Lucifer-Satan conflation that English readers rarely register. The deuterocanonical Wisdom of Solomon, a book held as scripture in the Catholic and Orthodox Bible and outside the Hebrew and Protestant canon, composed in Greek in Alexandria in roughly the 1st century BCE, contains the verse, "Phthono de diabolu thanatos Exulten, eis ton kosmon." By the envy of the devil, death entered the world. Wisdom 2:24. This is the verse the patristic fathers used to read the serpent of Genesis 3 as the devil. Isaiah 14:12 supplied the fall. Wisdom 2:24 supplied the motive. Combine them and you have the medieval Christian Satan, the angel who fell through pride and then envied humanity into death. Protestants who rejected the deuterocanonical books inherited the conflation anyway, because the King James translators had already cemented the Lucifer as Satan reading in English before the canon question fully landed. While the Latin West was building this composite doctrine, an entirely different ancient tradition was reading the serpent of Genesis 3 as the figure of liberation. The Gnostic texts preserved in the Nag Hammadi library, discovered in Upper Egypt in December 1945, contain one of the most radical inversions of canonical biblical reading on textual record. The Apocryphon of John, in Frederick Wyss's standard translation, has the demiurge Yaldabaoth declare, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me." The text continues, "But by announcing this, he indicated to the angels who attended him that there exists another God. For if there were no other one, of whom would he be jealous? The boast betrays the boaster. The God who claims to be alone reveals in the claiming that he is not alone." In this cosmology, the Yaldabaoth demiurge is the ignorant lower power. The true God is above him, and the awakening in the garden comes from above, against the demiurge's prohibition. In the Apocryphon of John itself, the awakener at the tree is the Saviour, who appears there in the form of an eagle to rouse the sleeping pair, while the serpent keeps its old reputation as a teacher of begetting and lust. Sister texts in the same buried cache hand the office to the serpent directly. In the hypostasis of the archons, the female spiritual principle enters the snake, the instructor, and teaches the first couple to eat, and the testimony of truth retells Eden from the serpent's side. The verse, "Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods," Genesis 3:5, is not a temptation in this reading. It is a promise that the higher God keeps and the lower God conceals. The serpent-venerating sects the Church Fathers catalogued carried the inversion as doctrine. The Ophites of Irenaeus's report, whose serpent moved at Sophia's prompting against the demiurge's command, and the Nassines, named from the Hebrew Nachash, serpent, who magnified the serpent as the principle running through all things. The serpent is a light-bearer in this reading. He brings the knowledge the demiurge has tried to withhold. The Gnostic texts never call this figure Lucifer. Lucifer is a Latin word from a later tradition, but the structural homology is suggestive. A figure who brings light, who is condemned by the higher power, who liberates humanity into knowledge, whose name in the dominant tradition becomes a curse. The shared shape is a narrative homology, not a documented continuity. The Gnostic and Luciferian traditions arise in distinct cosmologies and do not share a manuscript lineage. The same structural pattern recurs in a tradition that shared no manuscript witness and no etymology with the Gnostic Egyptians. Prometheus, in Hesiod's Theogony, lines 535-616, the Marconi deception followed by the fire theft. And in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, c. 460 BCE, steals fire from Zeus and gives it to humanity. For this crime he is bound to a desolate crag at the world's edge, in the Scythian waste where the tragedy opens, and an eagle is sent every day to eat his liver, which regenerates each night. The Caucasus of the familiar image is a later localization. He is the light-bringer in a culture hero sense, the Pyrphoros, fire-bearer. Greek offers two analogues to the Latin Lucifer on two different axes. The lexical analogue is the morning star word phosphoros, Heosphoros, the same light-bearer morphology, attached by Hesiod to a youthful celestial figure. The narrative analogue is Prometheus, who shares with the later Luciferian arc the figure of a being who brings illumination to humanity at the cost of punishment by a jealous higher power, and who shares with Lucifer no etymology, no manuscript, no genealogy at all. When this essay gestures toward Prometheus, it is the narrative axis it invokes. Percy Bysshe Shelley noticed this in 1820. In the preface to Prometheus Unbound, he compares Prometheus to Milton's Satan and prefers Prometheus, because in addition to courage and majesty and firm and patient opposition to omnipotent force, he is susceptible of being described as exempt from the taints of ambition, envy, revenge, and a desire for personal aggrandizement, which, in the hero of Paradise Lost, interfere with the interest. Shelley reads the Promethean pattern as the cleaner version of the same archetype. The Satan of Paradise Lost, the early modern English literary descendant of the medieval Latin Lucifer, is the version contaminated by personality. Lucifer, Hellel, Nachash, Prometheus share no etymological root. The traditions developed independently of one another. What they share is a narrative shape. The shape is the thing that travels. Two further instances mark the edges of the shape. The first sits inside the Jewish tradition this essay has been tracking. Movement 3 noted that the rebel angel myth came to Judaism from Genesis 6, not Isaiah 14. The Book of the Watchers is where that myth lived. In the oldest layer of 1st Enoch, 3rd to 2nd century BCE, the angel Azazel descends and teaches humanity the forbidden crafts, the making of swords and the working of metals and the beautifying of the eyelids. And for it he is bound hand and foot and cast into darkness in the desert, the whole earth's corruption laid to his name. George Nicholsburg, whose Hermeneia volume is the standard commentary on 1st Enoch, sets the Azazel episode beside Aeschylus and finds in Prometheus its closest mythic parallel. The gift of fire answered by the teaching of metallurgy, the punishment by binding in a rocky waste shared point for point. He reads the Greek myth as standing behind the Jewish one. Other scholars, Annette Yoshiko Reed among them, see a shared Eastern Mediterranean inheritance rather than a borrowed text. The knowledge bringer punished for the gift is not a romantic projection laid on the tradition from outside. It is already inside it, in a Jewish text older than the Gospels. The second instance marks where the shape stops. Zoroastrian Persia produced the most fully developed adversary of the high god in the ancient Near East, Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit set against Ahura Mazda, and a major channel by which a cosmic adversary entered later Jewish and Christian thought. But Angra Mainyu brings humanity no fire, no craft, no liberating knowledge. In the developed Zoroastrian cosmology, he is uncreated and purely destructive, the origin of disease and death and the lie. He is the proof that the pattern is a pattern and not a law. An adversary of the high god is one structure. A lightbringer punished for liberating humanity is another, and the figures this essay gathers belong to the second, while Angra Mainyu belongs only to the first. The medieval flattening held in mainstream Christianity from Gregory's Moralia to the eve of the Romantic Recovery, roughly 12 centuries. The Romantic Recovery began in late 18th century England, against Milton, against the KJV, against the Cathedral the Romantics had stopped attending. The recovery was not only modern and not only Western. Nearly 9 centuries before Blake, Islam had produced its own reading of the refuser. In the Quran, the angels are commanded to bow to the newly made Adam, and all bow except Iblis, who answers, "I am better than him. You created me from fire and him from clay." Mainstream Islam reads that as the pride that damns him. but one strand of Sufi mysticism, above all the martyr al-Hallaj in the early 10th century, read Iblis the other way, as the one monotheist so absolute that he would bow to nothing but God, even when God himself commanded the bow, and who took damnation as the price of the refusal. The recognition Blake would later make famous, that Milton wrote his rebel as the true hero without meaning to, these Sufis had reached about Iblis nearly 9 centuries earlier, and reached it knowingly. William Blake, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, composed and illuminated between roughly 1790 and 1793. The text contains the single most consequential English-language sentence in the positive Satan tradition. The reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. Blake reads Paradise Lost against Milton's stated intention. The poet who set out to justify the ways of God to men wrote his God as a tyrant and his Satan as the figure of liberatory energy. The poet did not know what he had done, but the poem knows. Blake reads the medieval Lucifer back through Milton and recovers the rebel as the energy of creative resistance. Lord Byron, Cain, A Mystery, 1821. Verse drama. Lucifer appears to Cain, gives him a tour of the cosmos, explains the human condition. The figure is tragic and sympathetic. Byron's Lucifer is what the patristic typology suppressed, and what the medieval flattening could not contain. Byron's Cain scandalized contemporary readers. Robert Southey, the poet laureate, had coined the phrase "satanic school" months earlier, in the April 1821 preface to his A Vision of Judgment, naming no names and meaning Byron's circle. When Cain appeared that December, its critics read the play as the school's confession of faith. The label was inadvertent compliment. The school existed because the medieval reading had been too narrow to hold the figure. Alexandre Cabanel, L'Ange Déchu, The Fallen Angel, oil on canvas, 1847. The painting paired with this piece predates Michelet's La Sorcière by 15 years. Cabanel was 24 when he made it. The painting had a contested early reception, and later art historical readings have often interpreted that reception as discomfort with how sympathetically Cabanel painted the fallen figure. The documentary record of the specific 1847 reception is partial. The interpretive frame is later. What is clearer is what the painting itself does on the canvas. The fallen angel reclines on a rocky outcrop in the foreground. Behind him, the heavenly host returns to the sky, luminous and small with distance. His face is hidden behind his crossed arms, but his eyes glare upward through the gap, wet with tears and rage. His body is anatomically perfect, classically beautiful, painted with the academic discipline of a master who knew exactly what his composition would do. The dual reading is in the paint. Lucifer remains the light-bearer. He is still beautiful. The fall has not stripped him of what made him an angel. Medieval Christian art was not uniformly hostile to the figure's beauty. Illuminated manuscripts, mystery play traditions, and theological descriptions of angelic nature retained the pre-fall luminosity. But the popular and vernacular register increasingly suppressed it in favor of the monstrous Satan iconography. Cabanel's 1847 canvas recenters the beauty the inheritance had let recede. The painting is currently in the Musée Fabre in Montpellier, and is one of the most reproduced images of the figure in the Western tradition. It is doing what we are doing here, in pigment instead of philology. Jules Michelet, La Sorcière, 1862. French Romantic Republican history of the medieval witch. Michelet recast the witch as a positive figure of feminine and peasant resistance to ecclesiastical and feudal oppression. The Satan of the witch's Sabbath, in Michelet's reading, is a liberator of the oppressed and a healer of the sick. Per Faxneld's Satanic Feminism, Oxford 2017, traces the lineage from Michelet through Madame Blavatsky's Lucifer magazine, London 1887 to 1897, to the early 20th century occult feminist publications. Stanislas de Guaita, French symbolist poet, co-founder of the Ordre Kabbalistique de la Rose-Croix in 1888. His 3-volume Le Serpent de la Genèse, The Temple of Satan, 1891, The Key of Black Magic, 1897, The Problem of Evil, unfinished at his death in 1897 and edited posthumously by Oswald Wirth, reads the serpent of Genesis 3 through Eliphas Levi's lens, as the astral light, the blind universal agent that enslaves the will too weak to master it, and serves the will strong enough to bind it. Guaita kept the serpent as a force, and refused it as a liberator. The same man wrote The Temple of Satan as a denunciation of the Satanism of his day, and spent his last years in an occultist's war against the Abbé Boulan. Where the period serpent did wear the liberator's face, it was in Michelet's Witch and in the Romantic poets. Guaita stands in the lineage as its adversarial reader. The Jewish parallel to the Romantic recovery happened earlier and harder. Sabbatai Zevi, a Kabbalist from Smyrna, declared himself the Messiah in 1665. His movement, theologically scaffolded by Nathan of Gaza, taught that the Messiah must descend into the Sitra Achra, the other side, into the realm of the Kelipot, the broken shells in Lurianic Kabbalah that hold the divine sparks scattered in matter, in order to redeem what cannot be redeemed from outside. When Zevi was forced to convert to Islam at the Ottoman court in September 1666, his followers did not abandon him. They reinterpreted the apostasy as the deepest possible descent, the Holy King becoming an apostate to liberate the sparks trapped at the deepest level of impurity. The dual reading was already operative in Lurianic Kabbalah more than a century before the Western Romantic recovery began. A figure who falls into impurity, whose fall is the redemptive act, whose dishonor is the form his honor takes. The shape repeats across traditions that did not read each other. The Romantic and post-Romantic recovery is a genuine intellectual lineage and equally a project of reinvention. The figures it elevates, Blake's Satan, Byron's Lucifer, Cabanel's Fallen Angel, Michelet's Witch's Satan, Blavatsky's Lucifer magazine Cosmology, are less pure retrievals of suppressed ancient meanings than original 18th to early 20th century syntheses informed by Milton, Swedenborg, dissenting Protestantism, revolutionary politics, French symbolism, and modern esotericism. The recovery runs from Blake, 1790, through Shelley and Byron, 1820 to 21, through Cabanel, 1847, through Michelet, 1862, through Blavatsky, 1887 to 97, through the early 20th century theosophical and esoteric traditions, with Guaita's adversarial volumes, 1891 to 97, marking the revival's counterwing, and Sabbatai Zevi's 1666 Sabbatean Theology, running in a parallel Jewish channel that the Western Romantic recovery never drew on, though the two rhymed. The recovery worked against, where it could, the flattening Milton had inherited and amplified. It also created its own readings, rather than only recovering older ones. The fifth reading is the one many of you will have met first, if you met the symbol through social media at all. The V shape with curved arms and an inverted triangle below, the figure that turns up in image searches when one types Sigil of Lucifer, is documented at primary source level to one manuscript. Welcome Manuscript 983, circa 1709, French, titled L'Art Magique ou la Science Angélique. Even that date is a reading of a damaged figure. The title page bears the malformed Roman numeral MCCCIX, which the Wellcome cataloguers read as a possible error for 1709. The earliest witness to the sigil is a document whose own date is a scholarly guess at a corrupt number. The manuscript is held in the Wellcome collection in London and has been collated against Wellcome manuscript 4667 and the BNF Arsenal manuscript 2795 by Joseph H. Peterson, the standard scholarly editor of the Grimorium Verum tradition. The printed editions claim authorship by Alibek the Egyptian at Memphis, 1517. The British Library catalogue dates the actual printing to 1817. The 1517 is part of a familiar early modern device, the false antique attribution. A pseudonymous author, a fictitious ancient city, a backdated year. The work attributes itself as traduit de l'hébreu par Plangier, Jésuite dominicain, translated from Hebrew by Plangier, Dominican Jesuit. Jesuit Dominican is a self-contradictory religious order attribution that no real author would use, marking the entire authorship claim as pseudo-attribution. The text dates itself by accident in a second way. Inside its own demonology, it parcels the world among the three chief spirits by continent. Lucifer rules Europe and Asia, Beelzebub holds Africa, and Astaroth is handed l'Amérique, America. A book claiming to be a Hebrew translation from 1517 does not casually deed to one of its demons a continent that Europe had barely begun to map. The assignment of America as a settled province of hell is the seam of an 18th century French hand showing through the antique costume. The Egyptian provenance is fictional. The Italian provenance A.E. Waite, proposed in 1898, is mistaken too, the Italian editions being later translations dependent on the French. The work is French, mid-18th century at earliest, with the printed Alibec edition dating to 1817. The sigil is therefore 317 years old at the manuscript level, 209 years old at the printing level, older than Newcomen's steam engine, younger than Newton's Principia. The sigil is one ritual seal among many in the Grimorium Verum, sharing manuscript space with the seals of Beelzebub, Astaroth, and an inventory of inferior spirits. Its visual elements, the V, the X crossing, the inverted triangle, the dots, are common to many of these seals. The printed Alibec edition actually omitted the sigil of Lucifer specifically. Peterson supplies it from Wellcome MS 983 and notes that the older Secrets of Solomon manuscript tradition preserves three distinct figures, where pop culture knows only one. The figure on the left is Lucifer in Europe. The one on the right is the sigil of Lucifer in Asia. The third at the bottom, Peterson identifies as a distorted version of the sigil of Sirach. Blockel's 19th century edition mistook that bottom figure for the seal of Klaunek, a wealth demon, and printed the wrong glyph in its place. The single sigil pop culture reproduces is the central element of that three-figure block, an object whose own printed editions disagree with one another and may not even be the most primary of the three within the source manuscript tradition. A separate popular claim derives the whole figure from a 9x9 magic square. The derivation collapses on contact, because these are free-form spirit characters of the grimoire kind, not the name-traced sigils that Agrippa's magic square method actually produces. The sigil's modern meaning was assigned recently, and by a named hand. In the Grimorium Verum, the figure was a working tool, a seal to compel the spirit Lucifer in a rite, with no doctrine of light or liberation attached to it. The reading the sigil now carries, that it is an emblem of self-liberation and inner illumination. The proud mark of the light-bearer comes from the modern Luciferian movement, and above all from the American occultist Michael W. Ford, who through his Order of Phosphorus and the Greater Church of Lucifer recoded the demon seal into a positive sign of the freedom of the will. The glyph is old. The meaning it now wears is decades old. The object the internet treats as an ancient revelation of the light-bearer is an early modern ritual seal, carrying a significance a living author gave it. A separate stream of misinformation about Lucifer entered the modern public sphere through one consequential hoax. Gabriel Jogan Pages, writing as Leo Taxiel, published an enormous body of fabricated exposés of Freemasonic Satanism between 1885 and 1897, including the invented Diana Vaughan memoirs claiming to expose a Palladium, Luciferian cult led by Albert Pike. Taxiel publicly confessed the hoax in a press conference at the Société de Géographie in Paris on the 19th of April 1897, declaring it deliberate satire against Catholic credulity. Eugène Weber's Satan Frank Mason, La Mystification de Leo Taxiel, published by Juilliard in 1964, is the standard scholarly autopsy. But the hoax's content, the Palladium cult, Pike's Luciferian doctrine, the Mason-Lucifer link, persists in conspiracy literature to this day. Most mass-circulating modern forms of the Masons worship Lucifer trace genealogically to Taxiel's 1885 to 1897. Fabrications without their proponents knowing the source is a confessed hoax. Older anti-Masonic accusations, Illuminist suspicion, anti-clerical occultist polemics predate Taxiel. What Taxiel supplied was the specific Palladium Lucifer Pike Diana Vaughan mythology, that mass conspiracy culture has carried forward. The pattern that holds through both the grimoire layer and the taxil layer, a relatively recent invention, is backdated, falsely attributed, or simply fabricated, then enters the public sphere as if ancient. The medieval Latin tradition flattened a complex inheritance. The early modern grimoire tradition added a false antique layer on top. The late 19th century hoax added a fabricated conspiracy layer on top of that. Each layer is younger than the layer below it claims to be. Each layer presents itself as deeper than it is. The 21st century claims share the same mechanism. A real surface fact is overlaid with a meaning the surface does not document. The fact is left intact. The projection is what circulates. The Lucis Trust at the United Nations is the cleanest example. The organization was founded in New York in 1922 by Alice and Foster Bailey, with the publishing arm originally called the Lucifer Publishing Company. The publishing imprint was renamed Lucis Publishing Company in 1925. The original name is documented Theosophical Philology, downstream of H.P. Blavatsky's London magazine Lucifer, 1887 to 1897, which used the word in its etymological light-bearer sense. The 1925 rename to Lucis was a defensive move against the negative connotation that the word had acquired in mainstream Christian usage. Lucis Trust holds ECOSOC roster consultative status with the UN, the lowest of 3 NGO tiers, shared with thousands of organizations. The Lucifer Chapel at the UN, claimed by conspiracy literature, is the meditation room, first opened in 1952 and reopened in 1957 after a redesign Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld supervised in person, with explicit non-sectarian intent. The room has no documented operational connection to Lucis Trust. The conspiracy claim conflates 2 unrelated entities into one folder. None of this means Alice Bailey's actual worldview was bland or non-esoteric. Her writings, a treatise on cosmic fire, discipleship in the New Age, the channeled Tibetan corpus, describe a developed occult cosmology with hierarchies of masters, planetary logoi, and an initiatic path. The honest reading is that Bailey was a serious 20th century esotericist whose organization carries a theosophical light-bearer name, and that the UN Lucifer cult conspiracy reading reads structures into the surface that the documents do not support. Both things are true at once. The discipline this essay has tried to keep is the discipline of holding them both. The Paul VI Audience Hall at the Vatican is architectural pareidolia, designed by Pier Luigi Nervi, completed 1971, with Pericle Fazzini's bronze La Resurrezione, 1977, inside, read by a 21st century conspiracy current as a serpent's head, with the sculpture depicting Christ in the serpent's mouth. Fazzini's own account, quoted in his New York Times obituary of the 5th of December 1987, describes the sculpture as Christ, as if he were rising again from the explosion of this large olive grove, peaceful site of his last prayers. Nervi's architectural philosophy, in his Harvard Norton Lectures of 1962, published in 1965 as Aesthetics and Technology in Building, emphasizes structural engineering rationalism. The audience hall's hyperbolic paraboloid roof is typical of Nervi's vocabulary across dozens of secular buildings. The serpent reading requires selective angle, selective overlay, selective ignoring of the building's other facades. The CERN logo is overlay pareidolia at the level of typography. The European Organization for Nuclear Research, founded 1954 in Merin. The current logo dates to a 1968 redesign, and CERN's own design guidelines describe its interlaced rings as a simplified representation of the accelerator chain and the particle tracks. The conspiracy reading sees 3 sixes in the 3 curves. The reading is unfalsifiable, because 3 roughly circular shapes can always be projected as 3 digits. The Google Play logo belongs to the same family of logo readings. A current claim holds that the play button triangle on a billion phones is the sigil of Lucifer. The trademark record is unambiguous. The United States Patent and Trademark Office registration, serial 975011194, describes the mark as a triangle of rounded corners divided into 4 colored sections and files it under the design code for media playback buttons. The sigil is an open line figure, The playmark is a closed four-color triangle, and the resemblance needs a rotation and a crop to surface at all. The convergence is the ordinary fact that any mark built to read at the size of an app icon drifts toward a simple symmetrical triangle. There is a complete paper trail for the play button and none for the sigil. The Bohemian Grove is overlay at the level of ceremony. The Bohemian Club of San Francisco was founded in 1872. The summer encampment dates to 1878. The cremation of Care Theatrical was devised in 1881 by James F. Bowman as a yearly ritual of laying down the year's business worries. The large concrete owl shrine, designed by the sculptor and two-time club president Haig Patigian and completed in the late 1920s, has presided over the ceremony since 1929. Sources cite heights ranging from roughly 30 to 40 feet, and the club's own records treat it as the owl of wisdom that has been the club's emblem since its founding. The bird the Greeks gave to Athena and the Romans to Minerva. Alex Jones infiltrated the encampment in July 2000. Documentary filmmaker John Ronson, who slipped in alongside Jones, wrote in them Adventures with Extremists, Picador 2001, that his lasting impression was of an all-pervading sense of immaturity, the Elvis impersonators, the pseudo-pagan spooky rituals, the heavy drinking, men at the apex of their professions who seemed emotionally trapped in their college years. The identification of the owl with Moloch or Lucifer post-dates 2000 and traces to Jones-derived content. Nothing in the club's documentation names Moloch. The most recent overlay is the TikTok native superimposition of the Grimorium Verum sigil on a human eye anatomical diagram. The mechanism is pareidolia, the perceptual tendency to project meaningful patterns onto ambiguous stimuli, documented at the neural level by Liu et al. In Cortex 53, 2014. The right fusiform face area, the temporal lobe region that recognizes real faces, fires when the brain is merely primed to find a face in pure visual noise. The same circuit produces faces in clouds, faces on Mars craters, faces in window reflections. The sigil's geometric vocabulary, V, X, inverted triangle dots, is shared with the other sigils in Welcome MS 983, none of which carry anatomical encoding claims, which is what we would expect if the geometric vocabulary itself, not the eye, were the source. The pattern repeats across the cases. Each rests on a real fact. None of the projections is documented in the primary sources the projection claims to read. Refusing to dismiss the surface fact and refusing to credit the projection are two different intellectual disciplines. Both are required for honest reading. Skepticism that dismisses everything carries the same epistemic shape as credulity that accepts everything. Both surrender judgment for a posture. The harder work is the case-by-case one. The deacon will sing it again next Easter. Lucifer matutinus, qui nescit occasum. He may or may not know what the word means in modern English. He may or may not know that the word he is chanting is the same word that the algorithm now wraps around an eye diagram and serves to you in 15 seconds between perfume advertisements. The Latin he chants is older than the modern English. Count from the oldest books that carry the chant, the Gallican Sacramentaries copied around the year 700. It predates Wycliffe by roughly 7 centuries, Dante by 6, Milton and the Grimorium Verum by close to 10. None of the layers between him and you is older than what he is singing. What you hear in the word is mostly what the medieval Latin tradition decided to hear. Refracted through 14th century Italian poetry, carried into English by Wycliffe, consolidated by the KJV, reinforced in literary English by Milton's 1667 Paradise Lost, refixed by 18th century French grimoire production with false antique attribution, re-amplified by 19th century French occult revival and the Leo Taxil hoax, rebroadcast by Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, 1966, and recoded by Michael W. Ford's Order of Phosphorus into a positive emblem of self-liberation, recirculated by 21st century social media visual overlays. 9 layers between you and the Hebrew word Hellel, that meant a shining one in a taunt against the king of Babylon. Each layer presented itself as deeper than the layer below it. None of the layers is older than the verse. The recovery of the alternative readings is older than mainstream awareness of the loss, though the alternative readings were always a minority current relative to the dominant Jewish and Christian interpretive traditions. The serpent-venerating sects of 2nd and century antiquity read the serpent of Eden as a bearer of saving knowledge. What we know of the Nacenes among them survives almost entirely through Hippolytus of Rome's hostile transcription of the Nicene Sermon in his 3 AD century refutation of all heresies. Separately, Gnostic texts preserving related serpent-liberator cosmology, Ophite and Sethian in type, were sealed in an earthenware jar and not recovered until 1945 at Nag Hammadi. Why they went into the ground is itself a contested reading. The older scholarly account has Pachomian monks hiding the books after Athanasius's 367 CE festal letter fixed the canon. A newer school reads the deposit as the grave goods of private owners and doubts the monks were involved at all. Dated papyri in the bindings place the book's manufacture after the 340s. The burial itself has no date in any record. The Nacenes and the Nag Hammadi finds are 2 parallel windows on the same broad Gnostic inversion register, not a single document tradition. The Easter Vigil, in a text fixed at some point between the late 4th century and roughly 600, has sung of Christ as the morning star that knows no setting. The Hebrew taunt song against Babylon, dated by many scholars to the exilic 6th century BCE and by others to the earlier Assyrian period, was a political mockery before it was anything else. The Canaanite myth of Athtar that scholars reconstruct behind it is older still. The planet Venus behind the myth is 4.5 billion years old. Reading in the sense we've been using it is the act of taking off the layers one at a time and looking at what was there before each of them was put on. The sources at the bottom are not unmediated. The Hebrew Hallel is itself obscure. The Ugaritic substratum is fragmentary. The Greek translations encode their own choices. There is no untouched origin to recover at the bottom of the well. What reading at this level offers is the discipline of distinguishing the layers and seeing where each one was applied, not the recovery of a single uncorrupted true meaning. Reading at this level is slow. It asks for Latin and Greek and Hebrew and Ugaritic, for the courage to disagree with the inheritance one was given, and for the patience to sit with what each layer of source materially says, rather than with what the latest tradition has decided the chain must mean. What is at stake is the question of whether one is reading or whether one is repeating, and the cost is not always only a cost of understanding. In northern Iraq there is a living people, the Yazidis, whose chief angel is Tawusi Melek, the peacock angel, who in their telling refused to bow to Adam out of love for God alone, passed the test God had set him, and presides as steward of creation, never a fallen angel, and never an evil one. One strand of the law adds that his tears, wept across thousands of years, put out the fires of hell. Outsiders, Muslim and Christian, mapped him onto Satan, read his refusal as the devil's, and called the Yazidis devil worshippers. That mapping, the same species of conflation this essay has traced out of Hebrew and into Latin and into English, was named as a justification for the massacre and enslavement of Yazidis by the Islamic State at Sinjar in 2014. The difference between reading and repeating is not always philological. Sometimes it decides whether a people is allowed to live. Lucifer matutinus, qui nescit occasum. The morning star which knows no setting belongs to the language whether the language remembers it or not. The deacon will sing it, and the choir will respond, and the candle will burn. The word will keep traveling. The fire was stolen long before it had any of its modern names. The serpent in Eden was a teacher in one ancient reading before he was a tempter in another. The bishop of Cagliari was named for the dawn. The king of Babylon was the dawn before the dawn extinguished him. Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of God, and at liberty when he wrote of devils. Cabanel's fallen angel still looks beautiful on his rocky outcrop in Montpellier. Sabbatai Zevi's followers still hold that the apostasy was the redemption. The light-bearer is older than the version you inherited, and stranger than the version the algorithm now overlays on his image. We owe the words the only thing we can owe them, a more careful reading. We owe them the chance to mean what they have meant in their respective contexts, before we decide what they now have to mean. Ubi facilitatem intelligentiae, for ease of understanding. The hardest part of reading at this depth is keeping the cathedral and the grimoire and the TikTok overlay distinct in mind, letting the morning star be what it has been in each register, a planet and a metaphor and a word that has carried more readings than any single age can hold. The Nag Hammadi codices sit in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Blake's illuminated plates are scanned and indexed. Guaita's 3 volumes are out of copyright in French. Welcome MS 983 sits in a temperature-controlled room in London with its digital facsimile open to anyone with a browser. The Exsultet will be sung next spring, on whichever date Easter falls. Each can be opened, each waits for a reader. The morning star will rise before dawn again in its season, over stone rooms older than most nations now extant. The word goes on.